Welcome to Ethical Hacking Essentials Module 10. And here in Module 10, we're going to look at IoT and OT attacks and countermeasures. A little bit of difference between the two of those. And you know, IoT and OT are ubiquitous. They are everywhere, from our doorbells where we can remotely see what's going on, to kitchen appliances, to hospital devices, automotive, IT, it's everywhere. We will look at some of the industries where it is. So it's very important to look at attacks for IoT, OT, and then what do you do about it? I got some countermeasures. So let's get started with that. All right, so what we're going to look at in terms of module objectives are, number one, just a little bit of understanding. What is it we're talking about with IoT? We drop down to number 4. We're going to do that with OT also, okay? And then we're going to look at IoT attacks and IoT tools. We're going to look in number 5 at OT attacks and OT tools. We're going to look at IoT attack countermeasures and security tools, and we're going to do the same thing for OT. So we're going to split the time between IoT and OT. Let's start at IoT. Sometimes IoT is called IOE, the Internet of Everything. And it is the idea that we are able to connect what before was just an inanimate device. Like for instance, over here I was drinking some tea, a little tea mug here, and you might think it's just a tea mug, but it can easily have an integrated package that's as small as the tip of your finger that measures temperature, maybe a water, whether there's water in there or not, that measures whether it's in motion or not, that measures many different things. You can actually have a cup that is on the internet and able to feed data back to a device that's on your phone, an app that's on your phone device, and know what's going on with your coffee cup. So on your way into work, you realize your coffee cup is cold. It should be. There's no coffee in it. So I'm just giving you just a really kind of semi-ridiculous, but definitely possible illustration of what you can do with IoT. And I will actually give a few more as we get deeper into IoT attacks. So with IoT, we're going to look at some of the concepts of IoT. And IoT, I talked about IOE, is the ability to network together devices that would have in former times been completely separated, inanimate, and what are their purposes? To sense, collect data, to embed sensors, to communicate what's going on. So it's just a thing, and so it's something that's implanted. It's human-made, machine-made objects, and even implanted on natural objects. Like for instance, you can implant a device, you push it into a tree, and it'll track tree growth and tree health. So you can even put them in natural, or you have a dog collar, and you get information on the location and the disposition of an animal. We have IoT devices that track wildlife. One of the fun things that you can do is you can go to YouTube and type in, I think there's one for eagle. I think it's a bald eagle. There are a couple of them. Eagle live. And you can look at a live picture of a nest where a little eagle has raised generations of eggs, chicks, and other eagles that flew away. And we have live trackers. So not just do we track on man-made objects, but we also track, and we have IoT involved with natural objects too. And we have many different parts of our economy, including industrial, wearable, home, and healthcare, where we have many different delivery modalities and usage scenarios for IoT. Just a couple of them: devices, medical devices, and health checkups, IoT. Tools in manufacturing, like think of robot arms and sensors and so on, IoT. We have wearable devices like smartwatches and phones. Your cell phone is an IoT device, and even your shoe. You can have IoT shoes. There are not many of them, but there are some. monitoring home devices, baby monitors that feed you the video, sound, and disposition of that little bundle of joy that's asleep in the little bassinet in that other room, right? So all of these are just scratching the surface of the myriad, the thousands, tens of thousands of classes and types of IoT devices. So how does IoT work? Well, there's a general framework that we'll see right here for some of the functionality of IT. So on the far left side, what we have is IoT devices. So this looks like we're in an industrial setting where we have humidity, moisture, temperature, pressure, sound, vibration. So maybe we are manufacturing something, maybe we're in a chemical plant of some sort. Either way, it doesn't matter. What's going to be happening is we're going to be using a transceiver to send data and receive commands through a gateway. This gateway connects to the internet. And there is a cloud area where the application resides that a controller, an employee, somebody who works with that organization, can review that data, make commands and control things. And that's the general setup. There are other models though, but that's generally how IoT is set up. Next, we look at the architecture of IoT. So way down here at the bottom, we have the actual edge technology. We have the physical device, like an intelligent node, a machine, a device, a sensor. Right above that, like I was showing you a little bit earlier, we have the gateway that has protocols, which are methods of communication between IoT device and gateway and the internet, which is over here, the internet layer, the connection between endpoints. And then we have middleware, where we have the logic of the applications, and then we have the application itself that usually gets downloaded to and installed on a mobile device. So that's a little bit of the architecture. So this goes a little bit deeper into application areas and devices. So for instance, in buildings, we have commercial, institutional, and industrial. So for commercial, institutional, we have offices, hospitality, healthcare, airports, and in industrial, we have processes, clean rooms, and campus. We have all kinds of devices that you will find in that setting. For instance, HVAC, that's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And if you think about it, all the controls, temperature controls, remote controls, valves, sensing for humidity, water leakage, so many different things you can check for just one of these. Each of these categories have many, many different devices. So we have energy and home and consumer and healthcare, life sciences and transportation giving us and the energy and everything from turbines to windmills. In fact, as you've noticed, if you've traveled on the road across the United States, and many other countries are having these windmill farms sprout everywhere. And if you are one of the people that work with these windmills, you have a lot of information and control that you can have remotely on apps, right? UPSs, batteries, drills, fuel cells, and if you look at the home and consumer, it's huge. You have an IoT TV, an IoT washing machine, right? When the dryer finishes, your app alerts you, so you don't have to wait if you have a big family and everyone's waiting for the dryer. Not that I would know, of course. Computers, desktops, PDAs, and MRI machines for healthcare. Surgical equipment is IoT enabled. And in fact, there have been medical hacks where a pacemaker that's controlling someone's heart rhythms have been hacked before. And vehicles and ships and planes and signage and tolls for transportation. And industrial giving us pumps and valves and conveyors and fabrication and assembly. And retail giving us point of service terminals and tags and cash registers and vending machines. And security and safety giving us tanks. I don't know about an IoT tank, I'm just saying. But definitely communicating with the soldiers that are in the tank. But you know what? We do have a lot of independent robotic weapons these days, jet fighters and platforms that shoot stuff like tanks. And the battlefield these days, the first level the first level of attack is cybersecurity. That's why it's so important for this. And we have networks. Every device, virtually every device on an IT network is an IoT device. It's able to be communicated with and controlled remotely and over networks. So yeah, this is just a little representation of the many areas, applications, and devices dealing with IoT. And this is also one of, if not the fastest area growing in this sector. So look for even more surprising IoT devices as we move forward. All right, so with all these IoT devices, there are threats and attacks, and there are many different challenges. So I'm going to summarize some of this before I go over it, but imagine this. Imagine you're in a meeting and your boss says to you, hey, I have this widget and I want to buy 150 of them and put them all through the company. And I need you to see if it's secure. And they give you the widget. You take the widget over to your workbench and you read, there's like an entire sentence about how to set it up. And there's a website. That's all the information on there. It's in multiple languages. And so you say, okay, let me see what this thing does. And you start the process of determining what this device is, how it works, how it can interface with your systems. In the process of doing so, you find that it has a web page that you can access over the network by going to the IP address of the device. It's a web page that you didn't put it there, it was part of the device. It's HTTP. You also scan the device, you find that you can telnet port 23 into the device to manage it. So we have that. Okay, so two protocols that are unsafe. So you use telnet to get into the device management interface, and there's a default administrator username and a default password. While you're going through the device, you find several things that are disturbing. Number one is that you can't change some of the defaults. For instance, you cannot change that web page from HTTP to HTTPS. Fortunately, you can turn off the web page. That's good. All right, so now we go to the interface. Can I change the port 23 management interface to SSH instead? And maybe you can't find a way to do that. And the next day, while you're fuzz testing the firmware, you find that the firmware has many different vulnerabilities. But as you look around for this device, you find no way to update the firmware and no way to change the default account. You can add a new account, but you can't change the default account. And so you find all these different vulnerabilities, including the fact that this device takes that data from the network, stores it internally, and then uses that data for a purpose. And the data that's stored in the device can't be encrypted, can't be protected. The device will not interface with any of your IAM, any of your authentication. The device will not use a digital certificate, and you can't get rid of most of the defaults. It's a dangerous device to have on your network. And what I'm summarizing here is basically the problem with a huge percentage of IoT devices. Lack of security and privacy. In other words, there is no encryption. Vulnerable web interfaces. In other words, you cannot use secure versions of the protocols. There might be legal, regulatory, and rights issues that arise from the problems with that device. There might be default weak or hard-coded credentials where you can't change them even though the default credentials are weak. There may be clear text protocols, ports that are unnecessarily left open. There might be coding errors, like I was mentioning, buffer overflow or a problem with the firmware. There could be coding errors with the actual software leading to a buffer overflow or storage issues. Or it could be difficult to update, or maybe even impossible to update the firmware, to update the operating system. So these are some of the IoT security problems. At the application level, you have the validation of the inputted string. So there's string data. String is like text ABC123, auth N, auth Z. but there's no automatic security update, default passwords, no firewall, improper communication encryption services, lack of automatic updates, insecure application programming interfaces, improper authentication, again, no encryption for the cloud. And so there can be a host of IoT security problems. Remember, IoT is built on application, network, mobile, cloud, device. That's all IoT. And so all of that all of those, application, network, mobile, and cloud, have to be secure. So some of the threats, we've talked about some of these already: weak, guessable, hard-coded passwords, insecure network services. I was mentioning HTTP and insecure ecosystem interfaces. So the actual device ecosystem, what those devices use to communicate with each other and share information, it's messed up. Insecure interfaces, lack of secure update, lack of secure components. They're outdated. For instance, sometimes what the manufacturer will do is put together the device, and actually on the board of the device, the integrated circuitry, some of that are components that have known flaws, or on the software that's installed in it, software with known flaws that's on this IoT device. Insufficient privacy and data transfer and device management and insecure default settings and lack of physical hardening. Remember that hardening, that word means to get rid of every port, every program, every protocol, everything that's not needed, any data that's not needed on that device. We remove it from that device, and it may be impossible to physically harden the device, meaning that you can't lock it down, you can't hide it, you can't stop people from plugging cables into it. These are very difficult threats for OWASP Top 10 for IoT. We look at some of the types of attacks that can be used against IoT, including DDoS, even an attack on an HVAC system, causing overheating, causing people to suffer. A rolling code attack. This is the type of attack that you do with if you want to steal a vehicle that has a key fob. Blueborn, jamming attacks, remote access attacks, Sybil attacks, where you use sort of a class of Sybil attacks. This is where you use a whole bunch of fake accounts to fool a system. There was a test that was done, and what the person did is got about 20 or 30 cell phones. I think it was about that much, maybe a little bit more. Put them in a wagon, and they were running Waze, the app that you use to guide you through traffic, and pulled the wagon slowly down the street, and Waze reported that 30 cars, they were all there, right, had a traffic jam, and if there's a traffic jam, it'll even reroute around that. Now, that's not quite a Sybil attack, but it is using fake identity. So I always remember that when I see Sybil attack. Exploit kits, man-in-the-middle attacks, replay attacks, forged malicious devices. Somebody comes into your business and takes away an IoT device that's on your network and puts their own in with their own agenda. Can you imagine someone in your house, you're not looking, they take your IoT light bulb and unscrew it and put in their own IoT light bulb that has its own firmware and its own uploaded malware that can communicate with the other devices on your Wi-Fi network? It's crazy. Side channel, ransomware, client impersonation, SQL injection, SDR. These are not just Wi-Fi, but the entire radio spectrum can be used as part of an attack. Fault injection attacks, network pivoting attacks, where IoT devices can be instrumental in allowing an attacker from getting from one part of your network to another. And then DNS rebinding attacks. So we have so many IoT threats to think about. It's very important to understand when we get to ways of protecting the IoT device. So how in general do we hack IoT? Number one, you have to listen in. You have to sniff the network. Get an idea for all the devices on the network, from the infrastructure networking devices like the routers and switches and IoT gateways and IDSs, IPSs, all the way down to the servers and the workstations. And then once you do that, eavesdrop on the network, and you find that they're IoT devices, you can begin to make a plan to create your own services. This is a fake server over here. Implant your own devices. These are the fake devices over here. Interface them with the network and use it to do a wide variety of attacks. One of the types of attacks you can do is a distributed denial of service attack. So what happens in this case is you make IoT devices that are compromised by the attacker into an army of botnets, light bulbs, temperature sensors, other mobile IoT devices. And then when it comes time for the attack, the attacker using their CNC server says, botnets on the march. And they send a huge number of packets against a target server, causing that service to go down. So a lot of times in history, you have seen IoT used in distributed denial of service attacks, bringing down some major services. You can exploit HVAC. And if you see this right here, in fact, you might want to try this. If you go to shodan.io on one of your tabs, you'll find a web page that looks like this. You can search for IoT devices through Shodan. Like for instance, you can type in camera. There are more advanced searches that you can do, but you can look for a camera, street cam, a speaker, or just try searching for any type of IoT device. If you get a good search, you'll get a list of devices and locations, IP addresses, information about it. You can find out again on shodan.io. Another thing that Shodan has is if you scroll down on the top page, there is a plugin that works for Firefox and for Chrome that allows you to, any web resource you visit, a web app or web page, get all of the information and some of the basic vulnerabilities of that website. So Shodan.io has a lot of good tools available for hacking IoT. And so in this case, you have HVAC running. If you look here, we have HVAC stuff. The attacker tries to get into the ICS system. This is an industrial control system. Gain control of that system, and they can carry out other attacks by infecting parts of that system, by taking advantage of security vulnerabilities in the system. And a lot of times, if the system works, it's just left there. Remember, where are the controls for HVAC? They are in closets, in back rooms. And so, yeah, you might have an Iridium server, but it's all defaulted, and no one ever even checks. Periodically, someone goes in there and makes a change, but that's it, right? Those systems can be exploited. You can exploit HVAC. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this is a rolling code attack. So let's say that I'm walking out to my car. And as I'm on my way out to my car, I get out my fob and I go, you know, it makes a little noise when you click on the button. But wait a minute, nothing happened, right? The car didn't unlock. That was very strange. Well, wait. What happened? On the first time I hit that button, there was an attacker. I don't know why. I don't know why he's not wearing a hoodie, but he does have these weird looking glasses, so must be an attacker. And so what he does is use it as a jammer to jam the car reception of the signal, and then he sniffs this first code and captures that information. All right. Then, since it doesn't lock, what does this person do is click that key again. And the attacker then also sniffs the second code. But on the second try of the attempt, the attacker forwards the first code and the car unlocks. So you have to be pretty quick with it, right? So the recorded second code is still with the attacker. And later on, they can follow that car. The person parks their car in their driveway. They go in and they are making a spaghetti dinner with their kids when somebody passes by the window and says, hey, Where's the car? Well, the dude with the weird looking glasses got the car from a rolling code attack. And by the way, you can put together rolling code attack. Like for instance, you can use a Raspberry Pi and other tools to put together the hardware. And then there's software available online for rolling code attacks. Blueborn attack. A blueborn attack is against Bluetooth. If you look at this, we have these all over the place in our home offices and in our offices. And these are Bluetooth-enabled devices, like Bluetooth-enabled printers. And so what happens is the attacker is going to do a discovery. Remember some of the discovery tools we talked about in a previous module where you could do Bluetooth discovery. We're going to get the MAC address of that device and probe it and get the OS information. And based upon that information, we can get network information. We can get critical information on the device. We can use the device to spread malware. One of the things I want you to think about is Bluetooth-enabled devices, printers in particular. Many of the printers that we have on corporate offices, those are pretty powerful computers. And a lot of them have general purpose computing modules in them that can be hacked. Very interesting stuff. That's a blueborn attack. Next, we look at a jamming attack. Remember, I was talking about purchasing a jammer and how a jammer is, under certain circumstances, very illegal. But this guy's an attacker, right? He doesn't care about illegalities. He's just trying to attack it. So what he does is he jams the communication by sending these random radio signals at a very high energy, disabling sending and receiving the use of Wi-Fi. Maybe one of the purposes of the attack might be to disable Wi-Fi based security, Wi-Fi cameras, Wi-Fi scanners of other types, and then use that ruse to get into the facility or whatever. There are many reasons for jamming attacks. Next, we talk about looking at smart grid, industrial devices, remote access backdoors that can be on those devices. Wow, there's a lot that you can do with this. Number one, in terms of how this usually works, is we need to get something on the inside in order to make this work. So what they're going to do is they're going to craft an email to a worker in the organization, and then the worker is going to open and be fooled into running a file. And so that malicious file, that malware, reports back, and now the attacker has a back door installed there inside the network. And then they can gain access to the logical network of that entire organization and then begin working on the SCADA. SCADA are going to be machines like sensors, actuators, HVAC, etc. And then disable the power supply, turn off all the power, leaving a city or municipality or a data center or whatever it is without power and causing all kinds of havoc. So that industrial grid, that smart grid, industrial devices, very important to protect them. And I tell you what, this is an area that is still highly underprotected and vulnerable. So we need people like you to learn ethical hacking and then protect these organizations. I had mentioned when we were talking about SDR, that SDR deals with the entire radio spectrum, not just like, for instance, Wi-Fi. Why does it do that? Well, because SDR stands for Software Defined Radio. And so what you do with SDR, I've done this before with EC Council Storm devices. You get it's essentially an antenna dongle. You can examine the entire radio spectrum. Just as an example, one of the really cool apps that you can do with the SDR is you can get the radio transponder signals from local air traffic, and then on a little map on your device, you can get the transponder codes of all the aircraft that are flying nearby. It's actually very interesting. And by the way, we're just looking at 3 here, but there are literally dozens, if not scores or hundreds of attacks and many other uses for SDR, right? One is that replay attack I was talking about before. Another one is a cryptanalysis attack where you find the cryptographic protocols and use that to find what the modulation is. And some of these can be side channel attacks to get the cryptographic algorithms and crack them. There are reconnaissance attacks where you just listen in at the radio level on what's going on, maybe getting product ID or getting information on that device. So there are a few things you can do, and there's more. Like for instance, one of the areas that I was working with a team to put together is using SDR to hack drones. You can do drone attacks with SDR. You can use SDR to attack anything like radio-controlled, anything that's radio-controlled. So if you see someone with a radio-controlled car or radio-controlled robot arm, whatever it is, SDR can play a role in attacking that. There are also fault injection attacks, and this is where, also known as perturbation attacks, where what will happen is they'll inject faulty programs into a system and compromise the integrity of that system. We see this mostly in things like EMFI, optical electromagnetic fault injection attacks, or BBI, which are body bias injection. And this is where we introduce faults into lasers, into anything that's producing electromagnetic pulses, which is a lot of equipment, especially at the scientific and experimental level. We can do frequency voltage tampering. Just one small example of that. If you go back before the turn of the century into the 90s, what you would see is people getting bigger and bigger CRT monitors for their desktops. An interesting thing is that there was an interplay between the interleave and the frequency and several other controls on the monitor. And if you did it just right, or in some cases just wrong, you could actually have an interplay of frequencies in that CRT monitor such that you could actually brick the monitor and make it smoke, right? So you could do a lot with tampering with frequency and voltage. You could change if you could change 120 AC to 125 or 130, you can burn out computer systems, cause fires, mess up power supplies, burn out chips. We also have power and clock, like I was talking about with the frequency on that clock, resetting, glitching, power supplies, even temperature attacks. Cause the weather outside to get really cold. I'm just kidding. It doesn't work with the weather outside, but it does work with the temperature inside, where, for instance, let's say that I have a sensor that if it's hot, it'll do one thing, or if it's cold, it'll do another thing. And I'm the attacker and I want it to do something, so I put a heat source in front of the sensor and it causes the sensor to change the environment. Or I put a cold source in front of the sensor and it causes the sensor to change the environment, right? So I can use that as a potential attack. Like for instance, I can fool a sensor in a data center into thinking that it is very, very hot in the data center and get all of the devices to start using too much energy. And I mean, there's just so many things you can do with these types of attacks. These are called fault injection. You inject a fault. It's wrong data, faulty data that causes trouble. One of these aren't fault injections, but they could easily be done by an attacker. And I don't know any of them that have been done, but rockets that crash or explode. There was one that happened in the last decade. I can't remember how long ago it was. The rocket goes up and then it looks like it's going sideways and then it looks like it tries to turn and then it just blows up. What had happened was there was a fault. Somebody had installed a sensor upside down. So the rocket was trying to get right side up, which was point towards Earth, and in the process of doing so, it blew up. So little things like that can cause huge problems. So fault injection attacks. The next thing we look at then is, how do you capture this information? How do you know whether there is an attacker in your network scanning or doing something with IoT? One of the things you can do is you can use Nmap to identify IoT devices. This is one of the commands you can use, Nmap. See a little -P? That means I'm specifying ports. I'm specifying port 8081, 8080, 8081 against that target IP address. And finding any open insecure HTTP ports, I can run IP ADDR show or if config against WLAN 0 to find out information about the configuration of my wireless. AirMon NG to go into monitor mode and monitor nearby wireless networks. I can discover wireless networks, note down the channels and traffic in Wireshark and in AirCrack. I can set up my wireless card to listen on the same channel. Again, I can launch a Wireshark and go on the interface. There are interfaces listed when you first go into Wireshark. And then from there, click on the WLAN 0mon and start capturing traffic. And so I can collect information on my IoT network and analyze it in Wireshark to make sure that it's as secure as I can make it. Other tools that you can use for IoT is Firmalizer. This one analyzes your firmware. Remember, I was saying that there are a lot of IoT devices that have pretty bad firmware. Other tools, Riot, Vulnerability Scanner Forensics, IoT Inspector, RFCrack, and HackRF1. Many very cool tools. All right, well, so SDR, you can do quite a lot with it since you can see the entire spectrum in terms of radio. There's one that's just very interesting called a fault injection attack. Fault injection attacks, otherwise known as perturbation attacks. What happens is you inject faulty information, faulty data into the information stream just to trick the system and make it malfunction. Imagine this. There's a data center, racks of computers that are processing data for an organization. Somebody in that data center goes to the one fire sensor and lights a lighter. And pretty soon the water sprays or the halon, if it's still in a data center, goes off or whatever happens. Or imagine if there is a sensor that adjusts heat and cold. And so you get something frozen and you put it right next to it and it thinks everything is cold. So it turns on the heat or vice versa. So we have temperature attacks. We can reset a clock or introduce a skew into the system. We can even use EMFI, which is optical electromagnetic fault injection. So RFI, magnetic fields, electrical induction, or electrical transmission into a place where it shouldn't be, higher voltage or even lower voltage due to other things. You adjust the magnetic field, adjust the voltage, and make it believe something else is happening. Even BBI and frequencies, and there's so many things that you can do to make it look like it is something else to the machine. Just one more example, I was talking about temperature attacks, but a lot of times in order to use software that had like a 30-day shelf life, I remember turning back the clock of the computer system and then getting another 30 days, at least while I had the clock turned back. Most software is a little bit smarter than that now, but those are just types of injection. You can inject a fault into the system by feeding faulty data into that system. Either way, no matter what type of attack that's happening on the OT or the IoT network, it's going to be your job or my job to capture and analyze that information using tools like Wireshark to do that sniffing. If you look at what we're doing here with Wireshark, we are using Nmap, and in Nmap we are doing a scan, and that -P there means the specific ports I'm scanning are 8081, 8080, and 8081. And then I give it the target IP address that I want. Let's say it's 10.10.10.16, or it could be an entire subnet or range, like 10.10.10.0/24. That's 254 hosts that it would scan on a subnet. So that's one thing I can do. What will this do for me? This will help to identify IoT devices, specifically pairing port 80 and 81 with 8080 and 8081. So this is just one of, there are hundreds of different scans, and there are probably like maybe a top 10 to 20 scans that you can do using Nmap for IoT and OT devices, but this is probably the best general scan. So this is one thing we want to do. So we run that scan. We can run ifconfig on the network. This is a command that runs in Linux. We can also do a IP interface command, which is a newer version of a command that does the same thing as the now deprecated ifconfig. And we target WLAN 0. This means I'm looking at a wireless network scan. We have AirMon that we can run, and AirMon is part of the AirCrack NG suite. And we put that NIC into monitor mode, meaning that it's going to act in a promiscuous manner, meaning that it's going to be able to take every single wireless frame, not just the ones that are addressed to that wireless NIC, but all of them. And then we're going to scan all the nearby wireless networks by starting that with W0mon. We'll discover our wireless devices, find the channels, sniff the traffic using Wireshark, set up our wireless card to listen to traffic that's on the same channel using AirMon NG again. We start WLAN 0mon for channel 11. It could be another channel, but that's the channel we have in this example. And then we launch Wireshark, and we select the interface that we had in monitor mode, in this case, WLAN 0mon. And then we can start capturing traffic going to and from that specific set of devices in that specific channel and monitor everything. And if there's anything that is not encrypted, I'll be able to see and analyze that traffic. There are other tools to help you analyze, monitor, and work with your IoT network, including Firmalizer. This is actually a very important one. The reason why Firmalizer is so important is because it helps you to analyze your device, identify configuration, even at the firmware level, hence Firmalizer, and look for vulnerabilities in that device. And we look for vulnerabilities with Riot Vulnerability Scanner, with IOT Inspector, RF-Crack, and Hack RF1, both very amazing tools that you can use to help analyze your Wi-Fi network, Wi-Fi devices, and your wired network, wired devices that are IoT in nature. Right, next we're going to look at some IoT attack countermeasures. So how do you protect your IoT network? There's quite a lot that you can do to protect your IoT network. And I will also offer these as not just for the industrial, the enterprise IoT or OT network, but also when you go buy a Ring doorbell or a Wise camera or a third-party knockoff IoT device. If you find a guest account or a demo account, disable those accounts because hackers love those. Attackers will take over your device and monitor everything you're doing if you have accounts like that. Use the lockout feature for accounts that have excessive invalid login attempts. Let's say that I create an account on an IoT device called Kevin King. And the Kevin King account, some attacker tries to hack that account using a dictionary attack. And so they'll attempt to log in 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and the 4th time it will lock them out and they'll have to start over again, which is a huge endeavor. So if you have an account lockout feature on your IoT device, make sure you have it turned on for all accounts on that IoT device. And implement strong authentication. If it's possible to use 802.1x. and use a radius or a diameter or a TAC-ACK plus server to do your authentication, then do that. If you can do certificates or two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, then do that for your device. You don't want to have a device that just has like a 5-letter dictionary password. Don't do that. You want to at least have a strong passphrase using the best encryption possible. And also for your local control system, your networks, make sure your devices are behind firewalls. And also, they need to be on a different subnet, different VLAN, different physical network than your business network. Because if your devices become infected with some type of worm or something like that, you do not want that getting into your business network. So remember, one of our themes of countermeasures is to have smaller networks, smaller subnets, and more of them. Also, we might want to implement end-to-end encryption using a PKI. And we could have, for instance, devices that can do it. We could have IPsec, IPsec communicating between the devices. We could have the PKI provide each device with a certificate. There's a lot that we can do with a PKI installed. Also, we need to make sure that the device has the latest update and patches in terms of firmware, and that if there are any vulnerabilities that we find on that device, whether it be software, cloud, firmware, or many of the other areas identified as potentially vulnerable for IoT devices, we need to make sure and upload the latest information and patch those vulnerabilities. You're not alone. You don't have to do this all yourself, running tools one at a time to first I'm going to scan the firmware, now I'm going to scan for open ports. You could actually use some IoT security tools that are built to do the whole thing for you, including CCAT.io, which is a nice little software as a service technology that's used to do reliable, scalable IoT, scan them, look for vulnerabilities. We have DigiCert IO Device Manager, Fortinet, Darktrace, a Semantic Critical System Protection, Cisco IoT Threat Defense, and I will also offer to you that both in AWS and Azure, they have very good cloud-based solutions for managing and searching for vulnerabilities in your IoT devices. Right now we're going to talk about OT attacks. And so that's where we're going to be. We're going to be looking at some of the OT concepts. We're going to be looking at OT attacks, and we're also going to spend a little bit of time on OT countermeasures. So let's start with what is OT. OT stands for operational technology. Let me just describe it to you a little bit. Whereas IoT, you'll find those devices in your home. Like for instance, you might have a Ring doorbell, and you might pick up your phone at work because the doorbell rang, and it could be somebody you know. Oh, that's Fred. And you hit a button and you say, Fred, I see you came over for once. Sorry no one's home, but go on in and have a cold brewski, and I'll be there in a half an hour. I'm locking the door for you. Lock it afterwards, please. And you can let Fred in, and he can go pop a cold brewski and wait for you to get there, right? So that's your Ring doorbell. You could have an IoT toaster, pop 2 slices of that really cool nut bread with like really cool stuff in it, and get ready with that nice butter, and then you put the toaster in, and then you go to another room and you get an alert. The toast will be popping up in 5 seconds. And so right after it pops up, it's nice and warm. You put that butter on it. Oh, such yum. IoT coffee pot. You go to work, you have IoT office devices, IoT cameras, IoT stuff. That's all through your office, all through your home. Your car is IoT, right? So you get out of your car. It's a brand new 2020 some type of really cool automated car, and you get near a parking space and you get out of the car and you hit a button, parallel park my car, and your car parallel parks into the space. It's an IoT car. Well, that's the world of IoT. Now what I want you to do is let's take a trip with me to your local airport. Now, we're not going to go into the passenger areas. We're not going to go into the area where there's food and the concourse and all that. No, we're going to go behind one of those doors that you have to have a badge. Let's go inside there. Let's take an elevator. We're going to go down 4 floors. We are now underneath the airport. And underneath the airport, we have a lot of the machinery for security, machinery for the transport of the waste and the water and electricity and fiber optics and all that stuff. And on one side of the airport, we have this huge automated baggage handling airport. But if you go to the other side, underneath, you find this equipment that's there for monitoring who goes by what sensors on the runways. And you get reports that get sent up to air traffic control and the FAA. And you have all this equipment under the airport. Also, take a trip with me to the city center and let's look at how we distribute all of the information from traffic light cameras and traffic light control on each street corner. And there are just all these devices, all these sensors. If we go back to the airport and the FAA, we have these sensors that are way out in the middle of nowhere that help guide airplanes in. And we have just so many city things in utilities, like in the water grid, in electricity, in gas pipelines. For instance, there might be too much pressure in a pipeline, and a sensor might tell us that we need to open that valve a little bit more to let more gas through. We have, like I was saying, transportation. I was talking about the traffic light signals and traffic light cameras and automation. Even in office buildings, besides the copier printer that's IOT, we have OT devices like the biometric scanners and the doors and fire extinguishers that might report in every time they're queried to let you know if they're charged or not. And then robots like Rosie the robot or whatever type of robot that you have in your industrial office. And we have things like in the hospital, ECG, MRI scanners, microscopes, and even medications and implantable items that are themselves OT. And if we look at this series of diagrams here, OT encompasses industrial control systems, including PLC, RTUs, DCS, and SCADA, which we'll look at in just a moment. These industrial control systems monitor all these industrial operations that make a city run, that make a building with HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning run, that are at the bottom levels of the airport, that are in General Motors, Ford, and Tesla manufacturing plants. So that is what OT is. A little bit different than IoT, a little bit more industrial. And they can tend to have devices that are a lot older and in many cases easier to hack. So let's talk about some essential terminology for OT. The first thing we want to look at is assets. What is an asset? Whenever I talk about assets in my classes, I ask my students to spell the word differently. What we're going to do is we're going to take those two S's there and we're going to replace them with dollar signs, because assets are what is most important for me to protect. What will happen if it breaks, if it goes away, if it gets hacked? If I have I've talked about this before, an HP LaserJet 3 printer versus a 32 node array of computer systems that are running a back-end database for a $2 million a day website. Are you kidding? I don't want any one of those nodes of that database cluster to fail, but I don't care so much if the HP LaserJet printer reboots, right? So one of them is an asset that's worth $2 million a day, and the other one is worth pennies a day or even less. So that's how I measure it. So we have assets that are like sensors, actuators, servers, workstations, network devices, programmable logic controllers. And then we have logical assets. These are software like control graphics, program logic, databases, firmware rules, all that kind of stuff. And you know this, I mean, you could have an array of sensors that are worth $300 each that are more valuable than a bunch of servers, because those sensors, if they go off, can cause a failure of a multi-billion-dollar plant. I could come up with many stories of multi-billion-dollar plants that went up in smoke, blew up, killed people, and failed because the organization didn't realize that it wasn't their million-dollar equipment that was the biggest asset, but the array of sensors that stopped that plant from blowing up, right? So you need to be very careful how you class your assets when you're dealing with OT. Next, we have zones and conduits. And so this is a way of segregating the network, breaking the network up into small pieces, isolating those assets to have good, strong security control mechanisms. So if an attacker gets through to one segment of your network, they won't be able to get to another segment where perhaps that array of sensors that's helping to stop your plant from blowing up is in that other segment, right? So it's hard to cross over. So we zone our OT networks and we create conduits. The next thing we have is the industrial network versus the business network. The industrial network are automated control systems that make up OT, and it's all industrial. Robot arms, conveyor belts, sensors. I'm right now in my mind, I was watching a video the other day of how, I think it was plywood was made or something like that, and there was an entire path from tree to log. They have these tree farms where they grow the trees, and then they harvest them, and they use all these automated processes to make a multi-layer piece of plywood. And it involves quite a lot of sensors, quite a lot of controls in an industrial network. Whereas in the business network, that's where people are running around with shirts with collars on them like this, and in a short sleeve environment, and people wearing suits and work shoes and stuff like that, right? So that is a different infrastructure. That business network is where we'll have our IOT. These two networks should never meet. They need to be separate from each other to avoid attacks. Let's look at some more essential terminology. We have industrial protocols, and this is an area that is a difficult area, I must say. And the reason why is because I've seen many people that have the best training, have been in the IT industry for a long time, can name what ports and flags TCP uses, what UDP is, what layer of the OSI model is, the wiring differences between Cat 5A and B, and also what the difference is between all the versions of Cat 6 and 7 are. And they could wire a patch panel and understand all the IEEE protocols, and they're Bixby and Cisco and Microsoft certified, and they have their other credentials, but they have never had an opportunity to deal with S7, Modbus, CDA, SIP, and many of these other industrial protocols. They're just a lot different. And this shows only 4 of them. And there are probably about 30 to 40 major industrial protocols on the OT and then also on the IoT side that network engineers are just not that familiar with. And so that is also one of the issues. So we have industrial protocols, we have the network perimeter, and we have a boundary network, like the network edge that leads into that industrial network, where we have a closed group for those OT assets to reside. We have the electronic security perimeter. This is another boundary between secure and insecure zones. So we may have some assets that can be outside and insecure, right? So for instance, just give you the example of a Wi-Fi network. I might have an office that has a Wi-Fi network that a guest who's visiting the office can get access to the internet, but then I have another Wi-Fi network that's more secure that employees can use, and they have to use multi-factor authentication to get to that one. And for the insecure zone for Wi-Fi, the employee or the visitor, will be able to just use a pre-shared key, like a passphrase. And that's the same thing with the OT insecure zone. We may have some assets, some OT assets that don't require the same security as the secure zone OT assets. We also have critical infrastructure. This is a collection of your physical systems, your programmatic systems, your logical systems, that if they fail, can cause massive problems, public health, economic issues, destruction, security issues, etc. What we find is with industrial-based systems, there are hazards that go far beyond what we see with normal IoT systems in a business network or at home. For instance, if I have a gas sensor monitor for a room that can tell me the oxygen versus carbon dioxide level in a room, we've had many accidents, industrial accidents, where an employee will go down into a room and not realize that the air they're breathing has no oxygen in it. There are other industrial accidents where there is a device that is moving out of bounds and makes contact with an employee. There are doors that should be locked that for some reason are unlocked and they cause problems. You can have a loss of life and loss of the entire plant with OT if you don't get your industrial controls correct. So this terminology is important. OT is very important, and let's continue talking about it. Here we have a little bit of the Venn diagram of where IT and OT meet. So on the OT side, we have mechanical devices, robot arms, thinking of that lumber plant again, saws and devices. Now I'm thinking of a Tesla plant or a GM plant where a door is picked up and or a chassis is put on top of a frame or something like that. So mechanical devices, these big robot arms or actuated devices, SCADA, DCS, PLCs, RTUs, these are all ways to control a small section of the OT network. On this side, IT, we have cloud and internet and networks and storage, and we have things that are really familiar to a lot of people like Java and SQL and so on. But for both of them, we need improved security, quality, and productivity. One of the buzzwords, and I actually like this buzzword, is that we are moving into Industry 4.0, this IoT, this IT-OT convergence. We have smart manufacturing. One of the best examples of that, I guess, is to look at how Tesla manufactures their vehicles with a smart blend of automated systems and systems that require human intervention. They are so on the 4.0 bandwagon. And there are many other industries and automotive lines and airplane lines and so on that are in Industry 4.0, where we have these OT and IoT devices and methodologies woven into the manufacturing. So this is a convergence we're talking about. They're moving closer together. And we have the idea of IoT for industrial operations, monitoring supply chains, monitoring manufacturing and management systems. And that comes out to IIoT, the Industrial Internet of Things. What we need to have another look at here, or not another look, but have a look at, is what's called the Purdue model. The Purdue model is actually something that we get from the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture, or PERA, which is used to describe internal connections, all the dependencies that we use in ICS networks, there are actually 3 zones in this model, right? So if we look at the zones, the 2 major zones are the OT systems, where we have our manufacturing zone, and the enterprise system, where we have our enterprise zone. The zone that separates those is the DMZ, or the industrial demilitarized zone, the IDMZ. So down here in OT, we have operating systems and sites and control systems, supervisory controls, intelligent devices, and way at the bottom, level 0. So 4 levels here. We have the physical access. And then in the enterprise zone, we have our enterprise network and business logic systems, and all separated by this IDMZ to make sure that if one of these is hacked, the other one won't be affected, right? So that's the Purdue model. If you're going to be working with OT networks, it's worth a look into the Purdue model. All right, OT is very cool. I mean, there's so much more we could say about it, but we're going to talk about some of the threats of attacks that we have for OT networks. There are a lot of challenges for OT. One of them is lack of visibility. I mentioned an airport before. The reason I mentioned that is because in one of my jobs, one of my first management jobs, I was both the IT manager and managed all our servers and network infrastructure and all that stuff, but I was also the facilities manager. And I was a member of a facilities management association that got to do a tour of our airport. And I was really shocked at all of the controls and the industrial infrastructure that I found underneath our local airport. It was crazy. And that's so true, lack of visibility. These devices are in water treatment and sewage treatment and the bottom sides of airports, and out in the middle of the woods somewhere, we have some type of device that's monitoring air quality or something like that. You just don't see them very often. They're not visible. They just sit in their location and run and provide data. But since we don't see them, we kind of forget about them. The next one is a lot of plain text passwords we find in OT devices, especially the fact that so many of these OT devices are so old, and they've always had plain text passwords since the device was installed back in 1997. There is network complexity. We have layers and layers of networks. We have subnets. We have separation between the OT and the IoT and the OT networks. And it gets very complex. Like I mentioned before, legacy technology, mixtures of devices from 2022, but also we have stuff from 1992 mixed in with the sensors and actuators and wiring and so on of these devices. Also, if I have a sensor and the sensor triggers, a little programmatic sensor, it triggers above 1, if the temperature gets high enough, it triggers. If the temperature gets low enough, it sends an alert, and that's it. That's all it does all day and night. And if the temperature is in the middle, it doesn't send any alert. Is there an antivirus that I can install on that sensor? Norton sensor antivirus. No, there's no such thing. Avast sensor antivirus. No, they don't have that either. No, there is no antivirus that you can put on most OT devices. How you're going to have an antivirus that'll run on a control board that is taking inputs from a conveyor belt and feeding that into 3 different robot arms. That control board has that one purpose. That's all it does. It's not going to run antivirus on it. And so if an attacker decides to write a virus for that control board, guess what? I have no visibility to that for my endpoint protection. Lack of skilled security personnel. I am so glad that you are taking this class, taking a big step into becoming one of those skilled security professionals. Because right now, if you go into one of the biggest job sites, guess what you're going to find? That there is a huge need for skilled security professionals. So I'm glad you're here. We need you. I think there's an estimate that over the next few years, there's going to be about a lack of about 500,000 IT security related jobs. Right? Surely that's enough for you to get one of them. The next one is the rapid pace of change. We are in an era of asymptotic change where you look at a line. We're used to change where there's a line that goes from, it used to be down here, now it's up here, like a little diagonal line, right? But instead of having a diagonal line, we are in an era where the line looks more like this, where it looked like it was going diagonal for a while, but then it shoots up. And we are in a curve point location where it's changing so fast that we can't anticipate it. We're still looking at the change and we're thinking that it's going to go this fast, but then we get to this time point right here, and instead of being right here, it's actually the change has gone all the way up to here. We're like, what just happened? Why are quantum computers breaking all my security? Why do I have to move from IPv4 to IPv6 now? Because things have changed so rapidly. We're in an era where change is exponential, and it's only through exponential thinking that we can keep track of it. You have to keep on top of it. And so we have there's legacy technology, outdated systems. So the legacy technology is the sensor, the actuator, the physical control, whereas the outdated system is that software that's running on a version of Linux that came out right after Linux came out, or it's running on DOS 6.1. Yes, you will find systems like that out in the OT world that are still running on antiquated software, antiquated hardware. And then we have haphazard modernization. It is very dangerous in some cases the way modernization happens, because what will happen is it'll modernize part of the plant, part of the system, but not the other. And therefore, we can put all kinds of protection into the nice modern part, but then we forget about the part that hasn't been modernized. And so we think we're protected, but in reality, we're not, because we have legacy technology and outdated systems in the parts of the industrial facility that have not yet been modernized. And then we have a convergence that's happening with IT. And again, that kind of goes hand in hand with the haphazard modernization. And then we have unique production networks, proprietary software. So in this case, we are not working with Windows 10 or Ubuntu Linux. We are working with systems that have been written specifically for whatever purpose that they're doing. So in fact, some of these are actual operating systems that were written just for that control device by a group of developers who aren't even working together. They're working for other companies. This was 12 years ago, 15 years ago, even 20 years ago, where they wrote this very unique software. And it's hard to protect it because it's so unique. And in some cases, it may be almost impossible to replace. So let's see, how do we replace this software? Well, this software actually is connected to 30 programmable logic controllers. And those programmable logic controllers each control 50 devices. And you need to replace every single one of those programmable logic controllers that we've had there for so long. And it's going to cost us $20,000 every PLC. And then we have to replace all the devices. And then we have to establish new cabling because we're just using punch down cables and twisted pair to communicate. Now we're going to have to lay fiber. You go on, and it might take $10 million to replace a system that's costing literally a few dollars a year to run. I mean, what a leap. It might be very difficult for an organization to pull the trigger on that, to make that choice to replace an entire level of their system because they have outdated systems. They have legacy software and hardware, and they have systems with vulnerable communication protocols that cannot be changed. HTTP, Telnet, port 80, port 23, SMTP, SNMP. These are all vulnerable protocols, and sometimes you have systems that are running these and they cannot be upgraded, changed, moved, or modified. Many challenges for OT. Now let's look at some of the threats. With all those challenges, that means we have threats that can be brought to bear on OT. Number one is maintenance and administrative threats. In other words, we are not maintaining or administering these industrial systems because we don't have the ability to, or nobody is looking into it. There could be data leakage because of lack of secure protocols, open ports, etc. And lack of encryption too. Like for instance, you can't encrypt the internal storage. There could be protocol abuse where protocols that are implemented on these industrial systems are being used for other purposes, opening them up further to attack. And then we have the potential destruction of ICS resources where an attacker can cause a fault in an ICS resource that can bring the whole system down. They can scan, they can use protocols in a bad way, they can do denial of service attacks, they can snarf data, they can do all kinds of stuff. They can even get a hold, and speaking of maintenance and administrative threats, they can get a hold of administrative interfaces through the internet if the IoT or the OT device is on the internet. So lots of OT threats, including HMI-based attacks, enterprise-specific tool attacks. Let's just stop at this one here, spear phishing, where the attacker does their research and finds one of the managers who's in control of systems and gets them to click on a link that has some type of malware that infects the OT system, looking for someone specifically to attack with malware, or maybe even looking for and scanning the network for unpatched OT devices. A side channel attack is an attack where you don't go directly at it. You don't go directly. Instead, you look for heat or vibration or other means to figure out what's going on. You can cause apps to crash with buffer overflow or get data or information because of poorly implemented buffer management, memory management of apps, and even exploiting RF remote controllers. We already talked a little bit about SDR and how we can analyze radio frequencies. And yeah, we can do all that with these things. There are so many tools and other things that can be used to exploit OT. I mentioned HMI, and this is the type of attack that we can have with HMI. HMI, what they try to do is compromise these systems. What are they? They're hubs that control critical infrastructure. And so they can gain access to the HMI system and cause physical damage to the SCADA device. What are some of the SCADA vulnerabilities that are exposed by HMI-based attacks? Well, number one is memory corruption. We're talking about the problems of buffer overflow. And so we can corrupt memory and cause many issues with that. Number two, lack of authorization, authentication, or insecure defaults can cause an attack. This is a really bad vulnerability. Running a default admin account. The password is admin. The username is admin or something like that. From there, we can do credential management-based attacks because the OT device, the SCADA device, whatever it is using insecure credentials. And in some cases, that insecure system cannot even be upgraded. Then we have code injection, where you can do SQL injection to the back-end database, LDAP injection to the back-end identity system, and so on. So we have HMI attacks, and in this case, we also have side channel, like I was talking about, where we're looking at physical attributes of the device, power, radiation, vibration, heat, looking at those other areas. So we have a probe, we have an oscilloscope to measure even sound. We can tell from certain types of analyses on industrial devices that are moving what types of bearing they use. We can look for power dissipation and find out what type of CPU or control channels they're using. There's so much you can do to probe the system and find out more about it, and then develop a profile of that system to tell you what it is that's in it, and then how to conduct your attack. So that's a side channel attack. A couple of different ways that you can do side channel attacks is with a timing analysis. So what you do is you monitor how long it takes for a device to finish one complete password authentication to determine a number of incorrect characters. So for instance, if all the characters are incorrect, it takes X amount of time for it to give me an error or to react. If only 2 of the characters of the password are incorrect, then it comes back with Y amount of time, etc. We can analyze that to eventually get the right password or other types of intrusions. Then, like I was talking about with power, you can either analyze the power itself, and you can tell there's a small dip in power every time it does an operation, or with heat dissipation, you can look and calculate power consumption and then use that to determine if a character of the password or was correct or incorrect, and eventually use that to, one character at a time, pull out the password and then hack into the OT device. So whether it's side channel attacks or attacks against HMI, these human machine interfaces, or DCS, there are so many different attacks, and one that exemplifies the kinds of attacks that we need to defend against is, or I should say, are PLC attacks. These are programmable logic controller attacks. And what these are used for is controlling physical access to infrastructure. And so what they do is they find the edge of the PLC that's exposed to the internet using tools. I just had you open up a tab and look at Shodan. Tools like that, and there are others, and they can work at hacking those interfaces. They can look at pin controls, they can tamper with other types of access. But let's have a look at how that might work out. Step number 1 is gaining access. So step number 1, where the attacker gains unauthorized access to PLC by injecting a rootkit. How does that work? How do you inject a rootkit into a PLC? Well, one methodology is by social engineering, getting the user, some user in an organization, to click on a link in a specifically targeted email. But when that happens, the next thing that happens is we launch a control flow attack against the PLC runtime. The runtime is that software that's running. Gain access to that PLC by, for instance, guessing the default password. These are all part of gaining access. Some of the consequences of that intrusion are, number 1, they get root access to the PLC where they can do whatever they want, or they can manipulate the PLC operations, as we see as a consequence of step 3. But after the attacker gains root access to the PLC, they can map the I/O. What are the interfaces? What is going into and out of this PLC? They can do some debugging and actually look at the low-level code of the register and the intercepts. They look at read operations. They look at write operations. And then they can modify the initialization sequence or other parts of the I/O sequences they discover, and manipulate the operations of that programmable logic controller. Now, some of the preconditions to being able to map out the I/O and to be able to intercept read-write operations is they identify the physical processes that are controlled by the PLC. So if the PLC controls some part of an industrial process on a conveyor belt, for instance, or if it's controlling a series of robot arms, it's a whole lot different, both of those processes. So if you can find out what it's doing, then you can begin to map out that I/O for all the operations. Or they can identify the mapping between the I/O pins and the PLC logic. So there's logic, there are steps that are written in the actual code for the PLC, but then there's an interface from this PLC out to the devices that it's controlling, or the device that it's controlling. And so a physical mapping needs to happen in some cases to get that logical mapping, and then to eventually manipulate the operations of that PLC. There are also hacks that can happen through RF remote controllers. And so most industrial machines have that issue. They're operated via remote controllers that use various logistics. They're used for logistics, used for mining, used for automation, construction, etc. And if you don't have good security on these devices, then the device can fall prey to a replay attack. So what will happen in this case, if we look over here, there's an operator that's running a device. This is at TX, that stands for transmit. So they transmit commands. The attacker is listening in, capturing that data, storing it, and then later on the attacker can use the same commands that they recorded in the replay attack, replaying that information back at the machines that are RX. That's receiving. TX, transmit, RX, receive. So that's a common type of attack. And we also have another one called a command injection, where we alter the radio frequency. So in this case, there's somebody that's working with a device. The operator here is sending commands where the attacker records that. Okay, I see what we're doing. Let's reverse engineer that, and then let's make our own commands using some of the same information in order to communicate, same communication protocols, and then send them to the target machine and give it your own commands. Make it run faster, make it run slower, make it do something different, or even just upload some malware. There's lots of ways that you can do that. They're also hacking industrial systems through using malicious RF controllers. And so in this case, we look at where we have a pairing that's supposed to happen between the operator device and another device, but the attacker captures that data and moves it to where the attacker is paired with the receiving device rather than the operator. And so now the attacker can do whatever they want because they're paired to that device. So they can repair, not repair, but repair a malicious device. One of the others that can happen with industrial systems and RF remote controls is that you can have a malicious programming attack where the attacker injects malware, but in this case, it is into the firmware. So it's not malware like a virus that runs on a Windows 10 system. This is into the firmware of a system, a remote controller. And what this does is it gives the attacker permanent access to every communication, transmit, receive in that entire industrial control system. So we see there's quite a lot of remote control attacks, SCADA-based attacks, programmable logic controller attacks, attacks to the human-machine interface, HMI, and many others. Now, you may be asking yourself, how can I do that? If you want to test your OT network, there are several different tools that you can use. One of them is the ICS Exploitation Framework, or ISF. It's a framework based on Python, and it's really like Metasploit. If you look at it here, we're just running the help screen on it, and you see the version. But you can go into the ISF and run attacks against OT devices. And one of the best ways to do this is to set up your own little mini OT network and then attack it. We also have the SCADA shutdown tool. We have Gressmarlin. We have Modbus CLI. We have PLC inject. But probably the monarch of attacking all networks, including IoT and OT, industrial and office, and whatever you want, is Metasploit. because it's an entire environment allowing you to use multiple modules to attack from many different perspectives. So lots of really cool tools that you have available to you to attack an OT network. So you have an OT network and you've been tasked with protecting it. What are some countermeasures that you can take to stop OT attacks? Well, here are some of them. Number one, use purpose-built sensors to discover vulnerabilities in the networks. In other words, you need to have you and your engineering team, based upon the type of network that you have, create your own sensors to ferret out the data and the data patterns that might indicate compromise on that OT network. So you have to work with your engineering team on that one. Number two, update systems to the latest technologies. So in other words, you may have to scrap systems and replace them with ones that are less dangerous, less open to attack. If you have systems that are not legacy, old school systems that can be easily attacked, then make sure they're regularly patched and regularly updated. Number three, implement secure configuration and secure coding practices. So when you're creating the software, when your team is creating the firmware, make sure that you have a process for creating code that is not vulnerable to common attacks. Number four, maintain an asset register for tracking and scrutinizing outdated systems. So what you're going to do is monitor every one of these old school systems to make sure that they are not going to be providing problems, and that you know where they are, what they are, and you have them on the list for replacement. Number five, use strong passwords. Not just strong passwords, but use long pass phrases. Get rid of those defaults. What's a default? Get rid of those defaults, and also get rid of factory set passwords of any type, and make sure that you secure using strong pass phrases. Number six, secure remote access to multiple layers of defense. Ubiquitous encryption. We want to encrypt the stored data. We want to encrypt the data that's in flight. If you have the capacity to use VPNs for all data that's exiting and ingressing and egressing your systems, then make sure and do that. Number seven, disable unused services. So if there's any OT system that has multiple services running and one or two of them are not needed, shut them down. You don't need them. Number eight, use only tested and familiar third-party web servers for servicing ICS web applications. Don't just go to random services for servicing your web applications. Make sure you're using tested and true applications for those. Here's some tools for you. Number one is Flowmon. We mentioned this a little bit earlier. What you want to do is find the reliability of your industrial networks. Try to avoid downtime. Tenable.ot, Forescout, PA220R. Fortinet has a very good SCADA ICS solution. And Nozomi Networks Guardian. And there are others. There are cloud resources, and there are standalone resources that you can use to protect your OT networks. So overall, what we see is that there is a growing number of IoT devices, and conversely, there is an old legacy of devices in the OT network, plus growing numbers of newer devices in the OT network. Oh wow, the blending of these provides you with ample opportunities for defending this network. So we talked about some of the many ways where we could go into each of these types of networks and work on network defense. So this module showed us some of the tools that can be used for both IoT and OT to accomplish that network defense. And so in the next module, we'll get into some cloud computing threats and countermeasures. And that brings us to the end of this module on OT and IoT.